Welcome back to the Convo Couch, everyone. I am Pasta Jardula, and Johnny Sue is still spinning on those ones and twos. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, I want to say thank you for joining us today. We have a special guest, but before I introduce the special guest, I want to talk about tomorrow's show. It's an important one. It's something new we're doing. We've been going to a lot of these protests. We've been talking to some activists. So what we want to do is we want to bring onto the Convo Couch and further these discussions. We've witnessed a lot of people with different messages out there, so we feel it's necessary for the Convo Couch to educate not only ourselves, but you, the audience out there, to see where we go moving forward with these protests. Because if we don't turn this into something solid, a solid message moving forward, united, it could be all for nothing. That's just my personal opinion. So I'm out there looking for Fred Hampton, and I've seen some amazing people out there. Tomorrow, we're bringing on somebody by the name of Brandon Lamar. He's an activist. We heard him speak at the Pasadena protest. It was something special when he got on the mic, the way he called out the politicians that were there trying to exploit the situation. So we're going to bring Brandon. He's going to be our first guest tomorrow. I am really excited. So check it out at noon Wednesday. And then next Wednesday, I'm looking to hook up with somebody else, and the Wednesday after. And we're going to continue to have these conversations. So let's get to today, because today is a fun one. You know me, how I love my foreign policy, yeah, I mean this is one of my favorite guests. He's a security analyst. He's also a climate change activist. He's also a fellow U.S. Navy vet and a nuclear engineer who went to school in the Navy in the Navy in O-Town, Orlando, where my partners live. You know him well. Mark Sleboda's with us today. How you doing, Mark Sleboda?
Hey, Pasta. Thanks for having me back on the Convo Couch. It's always an honor and a pleasure, and I'm still alive.
I think our audience is glad to see you're alive. People reached out to me. They talked to me about this certain situation. I think everybody's been so consumed with the coronavirus and now the George Floyd murder and the protests, whatnot. People forget there's a lot of geopolitical ramifications, I should say, going around us where we're involved, and people might not know about it. So I wanted to get your opinion about this situation because Ethiopia is almost done building a dam, a $5 billion dam to power and enrich their country. But it will seriously affect Egypt's everything, because the dam is going to be built on the Blue Nile, which really originates in Ethiopia, and 85% of its water power and its water flow up and down the stream comes from Ethiopia. Well, Ethiopia has plans to start filling this $5 billion dam in July. What does that mean for Egypt? Because if you look at the situation, this will be devastating for Egypt. What does it mean if Ethiopia starts filling this dam and fills it in 5 years? How will Egypt react, and where will we go from there? Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm really impressed to your viewers that with everything else going on between the pandemic and Trump and the Black Lives Matter protests in the U.S. and everything going on between the U.S. and China and U.S. and Russia and everything, that they're focused on the hydropolitics of that is a special amount of geopolitical interest that is pretty amazing to me, really. So here's the story here. The Nile River is one of the largest rivers in the world. It is the longest river in the world, and it is life for Africa that it runs through the 11 countries. Now, the Nile has two main branches, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. You know, the White Nile from the left, basically the Blue Nile from the right. And what we're focused on here is the Blue Nile, because that's the concern. And the Blue Nile starts in Ethiopia. It starts in Lake Tana there. That is the watershed for it. And it flows then through Ethiopia, up through Sudan. All right. And Sudan is a name many of you might recognize over the geopolitics of Africa over the last couple decades, and then up into Egypt. Those are the only three really concerned countries here. It's a pretty significant source of water. And you have to remember that Egypt is shall we say, a fragile country politically and socially. of some 100 million people, right? That's a pretty significant population there, with a very large percentage of the population towards the very young demographic spectrum, a lot of them without work, a lot of them without any economic opportunities. And this is reflective of a lot of countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. That creates a potential political revolutionary tinderbox.
Yeah.
And with Egypt, with all its political problems, with the protests and the overthrow of the previously US backed dictatorship there, the rise to power of the Muslim Brotherhood with Morsi in elections, and then also supported by the US, the overthrow of that democratically elected president by a military leader, the current president of Sisi, who, because he's not the Muslim Brotherhood, has actually been welcomed by much of the world outside of Egypt. And Ethiopia, as you well know, particularly if you're a child of the 1980s American TV and all the commercials, asking for money for the starving children of Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Ethiopia is a poor country with a very high population as well. And they're also a fairly, not modernized country. And one of the ways they have decided to try to remedy this is build a dam along the Blue Nile, right across the border from the border with Sudan. It's only 9 miles from the border of Sudan where they're building this. It's now called the Gerd Dam, the Grand Ethiopian
Renaissance.
Yeah. I mean, it's meant to evoke a national project. And
Yeah.
it is. It's going to be the largest dam the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa. It's going to have a power capacity of some 6,450 megawatts.
Yep.
Its water reserve capacity is going to be some 74 billion cubic meters. It's a big daddy dam. It will be the 8th largest in the world, and it will help control the flow of the Nile, which will help prevent flooding. And it will generate all of this electricity. It will meet most of the electricity needs of Ethiopia, and then have some left over to sell to neighboring countries like Sudan, which is one of the reasons why Sudan is largely in favor of this whole thing. Egypt, however, is extremely concerned because Egypt, their entire life depends on the flow of the Nile. That's Egyptian history, right? All the way back to the beginnings, even before it was the grain basket of the ancient world and the Roman Empire and everything. The Nile is the source of life in the desert the largely desert that is Egypt. And they're very concerned about another country controlling the strategic resource that is water that keeps their country literally alive. That's a great deal of geopolitical power leverage over another country. There was a deal in 1959 to allocate the water resources of the Blue Nile. And as you mentioned before, very interesting deal. 85% of the flow of the Blue Nile comes from Ethiopia. The rest of it is some small water sources that merge in and the amount of rain that falls on the river and so on. But 85. And in the 1959, there was an agreement that divvied up the water allocation of the Blue Nile. Which country gets how much, right? And they decided that Egypt would get 66% of the water allocation. And Sudan, with a smaller population, less power, would get 22% of the allocation. That's some 88% right there. And the other 12% would mostly be eaten up by evaporation and flooding. So how much does Ethiopia get that is the source of 85% of the water of the Blue Nile? None, because they weren't a privy to that agreement. This was basically an African colonial agreement between Egypt and Sudan that Ethiopia wasn't even invited to. They weren't a party to.
Yeah.
They didn't have a say.
I think, Mark, that it was brokered by Great Britain, by England.
It was. That is a legacy of
just to get perspective on
British
it. Colonialism.
Yeah. And it's reflective of the power in Africa today.
Yeah.
So Egypt is very concerned about this dam going online, and it could take anywhere from 5 to 15 years to fully fill, depending on how much of the water they are trapping at any one time. Now, here's Egypt concerns are with how much, first of all, how much water control Ethiopia is going to have over them. But also the amount of water that is water flow that is going to be diverted away from the annual flow down the Blue Nile, the downstream flow, and basically being deprived to them. And they deprive on the water. Water is life. They depend on it for agriculture. They also depend on it for hydroelectric power, because this isn't, of course, the first dam being built along the Blue Nile. The Aswan High Dam in Egypt is a major source of electrical power supply for Egypt. Mm-hmm. And they're concerned that they could lose, depending on the rate that Ethiopia goes about filling this dam, some 30 to 40% a year, which would probably lead to another revolution and overthrow of another Egyptian government. That is also a reduction of water for agriculture, for industrial use, for human use, animals, domesticated animals, and so on. It's a big concern. And then there's the whole historical thing that this will control flooding on the Nile River. But if you know your history, then you know that the agriculture of Egypt going back forever is based on the annual flooding, the old style farming, not the modern farming, but providing nutrients and silt that would flow out along the plains of the Nile Delta to provide fertile agricultural land. Now, Egypt has, on a commercial level, moved away from that type of old style flooding agriculture. But there are a lot of people in Egypt that's, on a private level that still, depend on it. Yeah. So that's also another concern with putting another dam and such a large one there. Yeah. Now, Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan have been negotiating over, the terms of this dam and who's going to get what and how much it's going to be filled for years now. And they've reached near the end of the construction phase. It was built largely by an Italian company, although interestingly, Chinese construction banks, state construction banks, invested heavily, particularly in the turbines that are, providing the power generation capacity. A couple $1 billion worth of the cost they basically invested in this. They fronted the money. So they have a bit of a concern here. But in steps U.S. President Donald Trump with his beloved Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, whom he has delegated to make a grand deal. Trump loves his deals, which he doesn't seem to have actually come up with too many of them. But having failed so far to get any type of deal being dictated to Palestine along with Israel, this seems to be the second thing that he's suddenly become very interested in. Yeah. Well, and the U.S. is supposed to be. Mm-hmm.
I want you to stay right there for a second, because what you're talking about, the grand deal too, as well. Let's also point out the fact that in March, Ethiopia told USA to take a hike when this grand deal was presented. And they said, hey, man, we're not playing ball with you anymore, so we're not going to even include you in these negotiations. So I also want to point that out as you explain the role of U.S. going forward here. Go ahead, Mark. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's exactly actually where I was going, because the way the three countries agreed on the U.S. that they would host meetings of the three countries in Washington, and the U.S. would be an interested neutral observer. So what happened on the run up to the last meeting, which was supposed to be being billed as a final meeting, when construction finished and filling of the dam is supposed to begin, this summer. They get the word in Ethiopia that the U.S. and the World Bank have sat down and written out a deal and are going to present it to Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia and expect them to sign this. And Ethiopia doesn't like the dictates that are in this detail. The details of, I guess, the water flow, the allocations, possible mitigation measures that, in case of a drought, that they might have to pay to Egypt over all of this, whatever the details. It wasn't hashed out between the three of them. They have reached somewhat of a stonewall in this. It's being dictated by the U.S. and the World Bank. And evidently Egypt was pretty satisfied with these terms, because we all know that Egypt has, at least since Sadat, the Egypt has by and large been a U.S. client state for control of Northern Africa and into the Middle East, helping secure Israel's security, which is the primary role that Egypt plays as a U.S. client state, preventing anything from happening to Israel.
Mark,
that's why. Mhm.
I just want to also point out, when you say they're a client state, I just want to also point out to our audience that Egypt is number 3 in weapon sales from the United States, only behind Saudi Arabia and Israel. So I want people to understand what's really going on there, that Egypt and I don't foresee Donald Trump, a businessman, walking away and turning his back on Egypt. So go right ahead. I apologize once again for interrupting, but I think it's an important point. Yeah.
No. You were actually stealing my thunder there, actually.
I'm sorry, brother.
You're all over this, Pasta. That is, not just military sales, but this is military aid. This is a gift to Egypt to keep Egypt on board with the U.S. project of securing Israel's security in the Middle East. And Egypt, as you pointed out, is the third biggest recipient of U.S. military aid after, of course, Israel itself. And this has kept the Egyptian government and the military, which is actually one of the economically most important elements of the Egyptian economy, is the Egyptian military. They actually control large segments. They control whole companies, right? State military companies. They control whole sectors of the Egyptian economy. That has kept Egypt politically pacified. And on the U.S. side, there has been some disgruntlement over recent years. The U.S. made some noise after the overthrow of Morsi about democracy and so on, and then none of the supposed punishments on cutting down on military aid actually followed through. And yes, Sisi has been flirting a little bit with Russia, buying some weapons from them as well. The U.S. is giving them their weapons for free for the most part, so they don't really have to worry about that. But they haven't been any major systems. So the U.S. isn't concerned like it is with Turkey and Saudi Arabia and other countries that might buy more advanced Russian weapons like the S-400. And sure, Egypt has also sided with Russia and the Syrian government in Syria, and also against the U.S. installed Muslim Brotherhood affiliated government in Libya, but because they hate the Muslim Brotherhood, which are active behind what's going on and everything in both Syria and Libya. But those sins can be forgiven by the U.S.
Yes.
Even the flirting with Russia, as long as Egypt stays on board for the holy grail of American geopolitics in the Middle East, which is Israel.
Yeah.
So this is why the U.S. has come down so hard in support of Egypt's claims on this. Now, let's be clear. The differences between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia here are mostly over technical details, right? They're small numbers, percentages, this isn't big geopolitical. Sure, Egypt would like that this dam never existed, but they can't stop Ethiopia from building a dam on its territory. There's already multiple dams in Sudan and the Aswan High Dam in Egypt, right? They know they can't do this. But the particulars here are over profits and water security. And there's something that should be able to be worked out between the three of these countries in a reasonable fashion. And there is a Nile Basin initiative put together about a decade and a half ago of all the Nile countries that would be the good framework for the resolving this. But once again, the U.S. has got to muck things up by stepping into this business, allocating themselves as the host and observer, and then presenting a diktat agreement that has terms a little bit more on the favorable side to Egypt, we can presume. We don't know the details of it. And you can see why Ethiopia is bucking at this. They don't like the high-handedness. They don't like the idea of their sovereignty being taken away from them over this issue of building a dam. Obviously, I mean, Egypt has legitimate concerns and it has legitimate interests. There's no question about this. This is something that needs to be worked out between Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia. But the U.S. stepping in is creating all kinds of problems that while weren't being solved, it must be said, negotiations were stalled, is probably making things much worse. And Ethiopia didn't come to Washington, when this diktat, because they knew this diktat was being handed down. And now they announced that they may start the filling of the dam. Again, this could take anywhere from 5 to 15 years without any agreement being reached. And that is important to the terms of any agreement that would be reached, because a lot of the concern here, not all of it, but a lot of the concern here is over how fast they're going to fill this thing, diverting flow from Sudan and Egypt. Now, Sudan has good relations with Egypt, and they don't want to anger Egypt. Sudan sits, geographically right between them, preventing any type of open war between Egypt and Ethiopia here. And they have good relations. They don't want to piss off Egypt. Egypt has a powerful U.S.-backed military for the region. But they also stand to benefit from energy being produced and then being transmitted to Khartoum, their capital. And they want to maintain good relations with Egypt. So Sudan is actually the best possible mediator between the two countries in this situation. They're an interested party, and they have legitimate concerns as well by this dam, but they also know that they stand to benefit from it. Of course, Sudan is not exactly a popular government in Western foreign policy circles there. It's part of the reason why the U.S. is stepping in and trying to dictate and terms things. And big picture-wise, booming out from this, what exactly is the U.S. interest here, other than Egypt and Israel? Now, there's some 54 African countries total, right? Most of them you've never heard of, probably. They're small little tiny things like Lesotho and some really big ones like Kenya with really significant populations and economies. Pasta, how many of those 54 countries do you think have a U.S. military presence according to AFRICOM? You have to remember the U.S. divides up the world based on military commands of that continent and area. And there is an AFRICOM that controls U.S. military forces and thus largely controls Africa. How many countries in Africa do you think have a U.S. military presence out of 54?
Mark, you know what? When we started the show, we asked that question. Let me play you a little video answering that question. This is our first month of the Convo Couch, almost 2.5 years ago. Check it out.
How about go to Africa? And he did so.
Well, there's 6,000 troops there, and they're all spread around. Like, we're not just there. We're in Chad. We're in West Africa, South Africa, North Africa. And you have to ask, are we there because we're actually trying to improve relations, as we always say we are? Yeah. Or are we there because of money?
So that was 2.5 years ago, and we talked. There was over 6,000 troops spread out in about, I'd say, 20 countries. Tell me the number.
50 out of 54 countries, according to AFRICOM. Now,
Wow.
that doesn't mean they have large numbers of troops. That's special forces and training and so on. But there are U.S. military troops having a presence in 50 out of 54 countries with 29 at least, right? Because there's always more that you don't know about that are secret, in at least 29 U.S. military bases in Africa.
Yep. Well, let me ask you another question, Mark, because while we're on this subject, because back in 2013, there was this big article that came out with Congress members, Lindsey Graham in particular, didn't know that we had that many troops in Africa. And fast forward to our presence today, like you said, 50 countries. However, it was Obama who also brought a lot of these drones there, and now Donald Trump is arming these drones. So how much responsibility? Because I'm not there to point out just Obama. I'm out there to point out empire. You know, the United States, the secret empire. How much responsibility does the system and Obama bear for these aggressions that will now take place in Africa?
Almost all of it. I mean, to be fair, Trump hasn't significantly increased U.S. troop levels in Africa, the number of bases, or the type of activity there. Obama dramatically escalated the type of drone extrajudicial, extraterritorial drone flying murder machine assassin warfare that was started by George W. Bush. But Obama ramped it up to absolutely huge levels. Mm-hmm. And it was in keeping with his idea that he doesn't want big, messy wars with large numbers of troops, which proved disastrous in the end for the reputation of George W. Bush and created a quagmire. He wants to do it on the small special forces level with a minimal amount of U.S. lives being put at military lives, uniformed lives, being put at risk in the process. And the way the Pentagon presented him for doing this is drone warfare. And that became his favorite thing. And it has to be said that Trump has then ramped up the level of drone warfare even more than Obama, which is pretty amazing, considering that Obama literally had tens of thousands of people killed. And most of those, according to the independent watchers that are very reputable, with the majority of those being innocent, not being terrorists. Right?
I think we have to point that out, Mark.
People standing by, they were innocent.
I think we need to point that out, that drone warfare, it might seem that it's better because we don't send our actual troops there, but with drone warfare, a lot more innocent lives are killed, right? Am I wrong when I say that?
Yeah, but they're brown lives.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
I mean, let's be clear about it. I mean, if you're in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Ethiopia or Somalia, and you're in an area where terrorists might be, right? Signature strikes. You're a number of people gathering in an area where terrorists, you're a target. You're killed, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, you always hear about weddings being bombed in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Well, this is the same thing. But it has to be said that Trump hasn't significantly increased drone warfare, particularly in Africa. So he hasn't increased the amount of troops. He hasn't significantly increased the amount of drone warfare actually happening there. He hasn't certainly reversed any of it either. But Donald Trump is less concerned with Africa than probably President Obama was, who felt some type of understandable connection to the continent and the country, considering that he does have some ancestry that originated there. But Trump is stepping in on a completely different level here. And again, more of it has to do with Egypt and Israel than any real concern about what's happening in Ethiopia and Sudan. But there is a bigger geopolitical picture for the U.S. military presence there, for the rationale.
Let me guess. China.
Why it's there.
Let me guess. China.
Yeah. It's not, I mean, of course, a certain amount of it is just about hegemony, right? And hegemony means having a degree of control and military presence all over the world. And that includes Africa, of course. But Africa's messy. And it always has uncertain returns. And the Soviet Union learned that during the Cold War. There was a point in the 70s where the Soviet Union believed it was winning the Cold War, particularly in Africa. But African governments come and go like this. All of that money invested, like the Soviet Union did with Sadat in Egypt, could vanish in a heartbeat. And the Soviet Union dumped lots of money into Africa and got very little returns out of it. A lot of people, when they're wargaming, talk about, which is a horrible way to speak of it, of an incontinent full of people, colonized people, victims of colonization, imperialism, but as a black hole that sucks resources in. China has been investing in Africa very quietly since the 1960s. They have a long presence in history there. But of course, with China's newfound national wealth, thanks due largely to U.S. neoliberal globalization, which shifted production for the world's consumer goods to China and so on, and they've benefited out of this at the expense of the U.S. ironically, and the resulting power shift that has been increased on a dramatically bigger scale. And Africa has become a geopolitical battleground between China and the U.S. because China sees Africa as a place of resources it can use to produce things to sell to Americans and people in the rest of the world. That's their interest in Africa. But China, the levers they're looking for are simply doing business. They may strike some hard deals, but when China wants to do resource extraction and other business in Africa, it's got a different way of going about it and doing things than Washington consensus neoliberal politics.
They actually pay for it?
They actually pay for it
instead of stealing it?
No, they go a step further. They want a continual supply of facilities and of educated local workforce for them that are a long-term investment, because that's the way China always thinks economically long-term, right? Most of their top the levels of the Chinese government, of the Politburo are engineers still, right? They think about the world differently than
that, Johnny?
Lawyers or military people or businessmen.
Yeah.
They want long-term investment. So China's big game, other than actually dealing with African governments, not moralizing them, not trying to overthrow them militarily, is building infrastructure, building roads, investing in like big hydroelectric dams that will help power the country and make it a better business partner for China to do business with. Now, the United States, what is its preferred way of combating Chinese influence in Africa now? What they're good at, what U.S. taxpayers, what you pay for, as the primary power mechanism of the U.S. geopolitically in the world, a big damn hammer. And when you have a big damn hammer, that's how you try to solve your problems. A military presence. There's those 6,000 plus U.S. troops in 50 African countries that we're talking about. And Africa has become a geopolitical battleground between Chinese economic investment and infrastructure building and U.S. military presence. And that is all coming down in small degrees, trickling into this document here, and why the U.S. is interested beyond Israel in what is happening with a little dam backed by Chinese money to provide electricity to Ethiopia.
Yep. Well, let me ask you one question, two questions before we get out of here on this subject and get to the next one. It appears that we have some rogue mercenaries from Sudan and South Sudan, maybe funded by the Egyptians, maybe funded by the Americans, who are causing problems at the Ethiopian border. What role will a lot of these neighboring countries play, as a lot of African nations will lose out on some of the water if Ethiopia fills this dam too quickly? Because, we've seen little things happening by the border. I don't know. It feels like there's a little proxyism going on. It's like a little piece of Syria is happening right over there in South Sudan and Sudan. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of potential for other countries to expropriate and exploit political, religious, economic, and other divisions in Ethiopia as a lever against these dams. And actually, the former popularly elected U.S. Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood president Morsi was caught on tape, thinking the mic was off, talking about using rebels in Ethiopia, insurgents, as a blackmail and a necessary means to sabotage this dam if it became necessary, if they couldn't get what they wanted out of this in negotiations. And don't think for a second that the U.S. isn't above using exactly those type of levers and mechanisms as well in this situation. So as fragile as Egypt is, Ethiopia, of course, is potentially even more politically fragile, and their government has a lot of political and economic capital invested in this dam project. This is being billed as the future of their country. They need to see this come through and come through well, which is why they're bucking on the terms of this deal being handed to them by the U.S. And I would rate the potential for serious military conflict here, like, say, Egypt flying their U.S.-made F-16s down and blowing up the dam.
There's been talk of that.
Between 1% and 0. It's extremely unlikely. The amount of opprobrium that would be dumped on them, not just by the EU and the other members of the actual international community, you could say, but by other African countries and other members of the Nile Basin Initiative and everything, is probably something that Egypt isn't ready to go to that sort of lengths to do. Certainly not something that overt like that. I predict there will be some hard bargaining ahead. It may come after Ethiopia has already started to fill this thing, but I don't think Ethiopia is going to open these things full throttle and increase the potential for conflict there. I think all the potential there is for a negotiation, a deal being cut, but I think the chances are much better of it being equitable and coming out if the U.S. gets out of the room. And Sudan takes the lead in playing the mediator between the interests of Ethiopia and Egypt there.
I think it should also be pointed out that this is such a huge national project for Ethiopia that they actually took a month's salary of governmental workers to help pay for the construction of this dam. It's huge. They're dependent on it. I think it could be really good for the Ethiopian people. However, I hope that a deal is brokered out. Maybe they fill it slowly and they can work out a deal. But there's a potential for anything right now in that region because, like we talked about, Obama brought the drones over there and the troops there. Trump just armed them, so who knows what could happen. And somebody in a super chat, by the way, said, Flying Boar said, forget Egypt. South Africa was once the breadbasket of whole Africa. Now it's a slum. Mark, last question on this subject right here. A lot of countries are nationalizing and securing their fresh water in their countries. Could this be the first of many wars with the most valuable resource on the planet now moving forward? After oil, I think water might now replace it. What can we expect around the world as far as water wars?
I mean, this is not the first stuff. There have already been multiple conflicts fought, at least exacerbated by water tensions, water security, water as a necessary strategic resource of countries. A lot of what is happening in Israel, between Israel and Palestine, is over control of the sources of water in a water insecure area there as well. The potential for water wars over the Himalayas between India and China is huge, because climate change means that water in the future, coming year, we're talking, a 20 to 100-year time frame, depending on a whole lot of things. The places that have less are water scarce are for the most part going to have less water. And the parts of the world that already have too much water, hurricanes, flooding, are going to have more water.
Yeah.
And that's a big part. And India and China both get their watersheds for the rivers, that provide life to their countries out of the Himalayas. And the Himalayan glaciers are one of many in the world that are melting. And we're looking at a future where water scarcity does become a even more serious strategic concern than it is now. I mean, it's not a 10-year time frame where water is going to be worth more than oil, but it will happen sometime in the future, right? Yep. We're guaranteed. The absolute certainty is that water is becoming more important, particularly in water scarce areas. And Southern California is a case in point about how water scarcity can have an effect on local communities and cause problems like between California and the government of Baja, Mexico, and so on. Now, blow this up at a national level with really water scarce and poor countries and insurgent warfare, and this will start as the potential to exacerbate conflicts, first of all. But yeah, eventually we will almost certainly see full-scale water wars. They have been fought in ancient history far before this, but they're going to take increasing importance in the world, which is why it might behoove you to take some interest in what is happening in this little tiny spat here in Eastern Africa, and hoping that an actual conflict doesn't. I think it's unlikely, but let's all keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, no shit.
Doesn't come out of that, because if there's one thing Trump is perfectly capable of, not that prior U.S. presidents have been any better, but maybe even in particular, if just in his style, is capable of taking a situation where conflict is unlikely and throwing all kinds of black swans into that.
That's true. That is so true. That's great perspective, Mark. Thank you. That's why we have you on the show, to talk about these things. Let's talk about the second subject right now. We talked about it. I had a show on it a couple weeks ago when it came out. Everybody went crazy with Obamagate. And what is Obamagate would be the question. Well, it seems like after testimony from many staffers and elected officials has come out, Obama not only knew about the Russian witch hunt, but he instructed James Comey, then the FBI director, to spy on his political rival, Donald Trump. So this is very serious over here. This is using the intelligence community to go out a political rival. How bad of a crime did Obama commit, and what should be his punishment? And give us your little intake to what Obamagate means to you. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I mean, if we're talking on a geopolitical and karmic level, this was a huge crime. He deliberately, largely for domestic political reasons, and it has to be said that Obama wasn't the only figure in this. I would look even more at figures like John Brennan, the director of the CIA.
Clapper?
Yeah, Clapper, the director of the National Intelligence Agency.
Schiff?
There's a few others. Those are the two big ones that come to mind there. But you can certainly see them having to sit down at some level with Obama over this. But largely over a concern of a domestic political issue, but also I think a genuine fear that Trump might improve relations with Russia at the expense of relations with NATO and European allies. Maybe not to a huge degree, but to a degree that the U.S. deep state, the U.S., shall we say, the part of the blob, the deep state, the foreign policy establishment, the blob is the foreign policy establishment, as Ben Rhodes termed it, sees the future of the U.S. as a global hegemon in some type of Thucydides trap, fighting to maintain their control against rising potential rivals for that hegemony, particularly China, but also Russia, and increasingly because of the way the U.S. is geopolitically fighting both countries, pushing them further and further and closer into bed with each other, and what has long since passed being a strategic partnership into what even publications in the People's Liberation Army are starting to actually call a Russian-Chinese alliance. And there are some. Donald Trump might actually have had a few geopolitical thoughts in his day, some that weren't entirely off base. Henry Kissinger is in particular one who tried to convince Trump that it needed to improve relations with Russia to deny China a geopolitical partner, that Russia is not a superpower anymore, and it probably won't ever be again, right? Having been divested of so much population, so much territory, and having fallen such a huge, dramatic economic drop, economic and social terms in the catastrophe of the 90s. But that it could still play the kingmaker role between a future world dominated by either the U.S. or China. And I think Trump, at some level, and I think he does admire Putin. I think that's clear from his personal relations with him. But that's okay. I mean, I criticize Putin all the time, but there's a lot of things I admire about him as well. And I voted for him as the president of Russia, with caveats that I don't agree with everything, although they're probably not the same thing that a lot of liberals in the U.S. might have concerns with. But I live here now.
Yeah. Well, you know what, Mark, really quick, I'm saying if I had your choice, seeing him bareback on the horse, Putin, or with a hockey stick in his hand, he gets my vote. Go ahead, buddy.
Yeah. Anyway, so I think Trump bought into that. And although it's a dollar way too short, or a ruble, whatever we want to term it, and far too late for Russia to risk ruining its relationships with a power rising China over the U.S. The U.S. security establishment, the deep state, the blob, are invested in Russia being an enemy.
Yeah.
That keeps their U.S. presence in Europe. It provides a rationale for it. It provides a rationale for them putting troops all over this part of the world other than just China. And they're still largely locked in a Cold War mentality where they do see Russia as an inevitable enemy. And they couldn't see Trump making concessions the way they look at it geopolitically to Russia, like Trump not caring what happened in Ukraine, or Trump wanting out of Syria, that even if Trump was only in office for 4 years, they believed would geopolitically set back the U.S. in its confrontation with Russia and thus China by decades. So they wanted to make sure that Trump couldn't improve relations with Russia. And part of that was by tarring him from the beginning with this whole Russia collusion thing, the idea that it wasn't Americans who genuinely had disagreements with Hillary Clinton and to some degree were bought in by Trump's bullshit, or simply paying attention to them as victims of globalization, the way the Democrats never even so much as dignified that was a possibility. Everyone benefited from globalization. To the contrary, not everyone did. And a lot of those people in states like Pennsylvania and Minnesota and other end up voting for Trump because of it. Even if Trump couldn't actually do anything to make their lives better, at the very least, he paid some attention to them and recognized, that globalization had caused them to lose high-paying manufacturing jobs. I don't think Trump can actually fix those things. And he certainly hasn't done anything really to improve it in the last 4 years. I don't think he would in the next 4 years, but it's this whole idea that Russians were responsible for electing, this denial of agency to almost half of the American population. But it also has resulted in the worst relations with Russia I mean, we're talking levels of tension between the US and Russia right now are in many ways worse than they were during the height of the Cold War, because now there's no longer any type of respect or fear of each other as, at least military peers. And while that is true strategically, nuclearly, in nuclear terms, the U.S. doesn't believe that it has to compromise with Russia on just about anything.
Yeah.
It thinks that its national, meaning global interests, always override Russia's interests, even in its close abroad and within its own country. So that is part of the whole rationale why this whole deep state, these figures and Obama set out not just to ruin Trump politically, but to make sure that no matter what, he couldn't act and improve relations with Russia, which they believed, in their conception of U.S. geopolitics and national interests, would reduces the U.S.'s geopolitical standing vis-a-vis Russia in the world. And hence this whole nonsense with Flynn. You don't have to like Flynn. I don't like him with Turkey and lots of other real serious things that he did. But there was this whole lying thing with the FBI that was used. And it was absolutely essential for them to remove Flynn first from the Trump administration, because Flynn had been the director of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, under Obama. He understood the way these intelligence institutions worked, and he would be able to ascertain and stop this type of intelligence community, deep state sabotage of the Trump administration. Not that it really needed any help. It would sabotage itself in other spheres just fine, but particularly on this whole Russia thing.
Yeah.
And that Mark, is, part of the whole reason why it was essential for them to get rid of Flynn first.
Can we stay on that 1 second? Because I think with Flynn, it was also the trifecta. Not only did he understand what was going on, but it was to send a message to Donald Trump. Now, we'll go after your national security advisor. And also, I think this is political payback, because if you remember correctly, when Obama was out there and flaunting the fact that he had gotten Osama bin Laden, General Flynn was on Al Jazeera with Mehdi Hassan saying, no, what they did, what Obama did policy-wise in Syria was his fault, and he advised him not to go that way. And it was like a trifecta. We got to remove this guy because he understands what's going on with the intelligence community. Number two, we're going to let Donald Trump know that we're going to take out his national security advisor. And number three, you don't cross me, boy, Obama said to Mr. Flynn, and said, we're going to remove you for exposing us what we did in Syria. Yeah, and the whole thing about it is Uncle Joe was in the room, and he knew. So Joe Biden also has a price to pay for this too as well, because when he got called out for it, he actually had to backtrack on national TV. What price does not only Obama have to pay, but Uncle Joe knew as well?
Yeah, I mean, that I think you're hitting on a really important port. Remember that not only was Flynn the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, he was under Obama, and it was Obama that eventually got rid of him.
Yeah.
Right? Made sure he was removed. And we don't know how much of that was due to disagreement over what Obama was doing to launch a proxy war to remove the Syrian government using jihadis, and how much was beef over potentially other things. We don't know. I think we have to assume that a big portion of it was disagreement over, regime change operations with jihadis in Syria. And Flynn has hinted at that a number of times. And I spoke very briefly to him here in Moscow when he was attending an event for Russia Today, where I was also attending as a regular contributor there. I asked him dead up about Syria and U.S. support for Al-Qaeda there. And he kind of hedged, and you know, he's always intimated how much he was against the methodology that the U.S. was using to overthrow the Syrian government, but
Yeah.
hasn't never, directly came out as a protester against what was going on there. But I think it was a big part of it. And I think the Trump's administration foreign policy and ability to manage its own government and the Russiagate investigation would have been much better if Flynn in particular had been a regular part of his administration rather than, bringing in, arch neocons, like Bolton to then eventually be a Trump's national security advisor.
Yeah.
I say you don't have to love Flynn. There's plenty of other things to not like the man about: his relations with Turkey, and lobbying,
And his attitude towards China. Flynn's attitude towards China, I think that's why more than anything that Trump picked Flynn, because he was like, China is our geopolitical enemy, but he also understood that Russia was no longer the nation it once was, and you hit that on the nose. Well, let me ask you another question. There are many institutional players who selfishly pushed the whole Russian Russian hoax in the past 4 years. I have several players. I want to know which one of these players you think played the biggest role and should be held the most accountable. Was it John Brennan, Adam Schiff, Rachel Maddow, James Clapper, or Hillary Clinton? Which one of those five played the biggest role and should be held the accountable the most?
Okay, well, should is the operative word there, because I think we can probably agree on that none of them are ever going to be held accountable any more than people were held accountable for torture during the George W. Bush administration by the then Obama administration. Now, that's just not the way Washington works. There won't be any legal proceedings. No one will ever be held accountable. But of those you mentioned, if I had to pick my pick of the one more responsible than the others, and it would be close between Clapper and Brennan in that, but I'd have to give the top score, the one that I suspect had the most, shall we say, will and drive in all of this, is Brennan.
Okay.
John Brennan,
Why?
former director of the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is, I think, simply down to his personality and the strengths of the beliefs. And we have to remember now that Brennan and Clapper are now both analysts paid by the corporate media to be telling the American people what they should be thinking about security and foreign policy and geopolitical matters on television. You don't have to get your propaganda by some middle level, analyst like say me or something. You can get it right from the former director of the CIA. And they accuse other countries of propaganda. Wow.
Yeah. Well, listen. Through this whole process, CrowdStrike also admitted that they had zero empirical evidence that Russia hacked the DNC servers. I mean, what does that mean for a guy like Adam Schiff? Because Adam Schiff is the guy on my list that I hold most responsible, because he knew about this 2 years ago, yet he still went out there and spewing this information. And more importantly, the fact that CrowdStrike said that there was no empirical evidence that Russia hacked the servers. What does that mean for Julian Assange? Doesn't that completely clear his name?
No, because facts do not change narratives.
Oh, you're right.
And if you think they do, that is a serious misunderstanding. You can have all the facts on your side. You can find out years down the line that the conspiracy theorists were right all along, and your actual conspiracy was responsible for this. That doesn't change narratives. It doesn't hold people accountable. And does Adam Schiff and his wantingly spewed disinfo creating an unnecessary level of geopolitical tension with another nuclear armed great power, should he be accountable for that? Absolutely. Does it mean anything for him eventually? No. Why? Because the viewers out there, okay, you understand that you're a breed apart from most Democrats and Green Party voters and whoever you might eventually come down to voting for, if at all, progressives and so on. I think you understand that you're a minority if you care about foreign policy and geopolitical issues at all, despite the fact that it should be, because constitutionally, the president's primary constitutionally derived powers are over foreign policy and the military and the vast intelligence community that has been built up, in the days since its founding. But Americans, by and large, Democrats, Republicans, they don't vote over foreign policy issues. They simply don't. Right? Minority, sure. Maybe the viewers out there do care, but the vast majority of Americans don't. And Americans, when they go to vote for Schiff for re-election, or they go to vote between Trump and Joe Biden, they are not going to vote, by and large, majority speaking, on what they think happened in Ukraine, or with the U.S.-backed putsch regime there, or on Russiagate and relations with Russia, and did Flynn really lie, or did he not lie, and did he have a deal with sanctions on Russia, or just was there an unspoken understanding, which is actually perfectly legitimate for an incoming administration to begin with, I hate to tell you. But Americans aren't going to vote on that, because Americans, by and large, vote on pocketbook issues and issues of identity. And their idea of foreign policy with Ukraine or Russia or other countries simply doesn't factor in, and it's not going to mean either a legal or a political cost at least on those particular things, for Joe Biden or for Adam Schiff or for an eventual President Michelle Obama or anywhere else.
Or Oprah. Yeah, and it's a shame that Julian Assange, who really is a truth teller, that's got to sit in prison, and who knows what's in store for Julian Assange. And it's a shame that we haven't had anybody really step up and speak up for Julian Assange, because what he did was provide transparency to Americans and people across the world.
He held the hegemon to account for some of its crimes, and he will never be and cannot be forgiven, because of the deterrent value. Punishing him prevents other people from following down that same path.
Yeah, that's a shame. I mean, well, it appears the intelligence community is way out of control at this point. I mean, Mark, what is your suggestion to how we curtail the CIA and the FBI? And then finally, the last question: was Obama giving orders or just taking orders? Because I think it's, his relationship with the intelligence community it's mind-blowing to some of us out there who really do pay attention to this, because he was supposed to be, a beacon of hope, that was going to straighten things out. And we certainly didn't see him doing all these moves and what happened in Libya and everything. So what do we do to curtail the intelligence community? And what was Obama's role? Giving orders or taking orders?
Let me start with the second one. And I bear a degree of responsibility, because at the time I helped get hundreds of people registered to vote for Obama. When I was studying at the LSE at the time, I worked with the embassy, a U.S. embassy here in Russia, to register people prior to that. And I even said, I'll be out protesting Obama the day after the election, but it's got to be better than George W. Bush.
Yeah.
No, not really. Just a continuation of the same thing. And if anything, even more, because he normalized these foreign policy measures like drone warfare, like the increasing of tensions, and he made any possible alternative from the nominal left, the liberal side of U.S. politics, impossible, by moving the U.S., the Democratic Party, firmly in bed to an even greater degree than the Republicans with the national security state.
Yeah.
So I bear a degree of responsibility there. Was Obama giving or taking orders? Of course, there's always a bit of give and take there. But I think Obama himself probably pictured his presidency, West Wing style, being something far different when he was running on campaign than what actually happened when he was presented with the realities of American power and power projection in the world, and the whole thing by the national security state. I think in a way he became kind of a Stockholm syndrome. I think the way most U.S. presidents do when they take the office and find out that they're the nominal commander in chief of the world, the global military hegemon. Does that absolve him from any degree of responsibility? No, of course not. But I think a lot of this was pushed by, these unelected bureaucrats in the national security state, particularly in the intelligence branches of it. At the end of the day, I think are even more dangerous than the military industrial complex, the Pentagon brass and so on. It's the CIA and the DIA and now the Director of National Intelligence, these other offices that are the ones. Now, how do you Americans change that? Well,
that's the big question.
John Kennedy quite famously allegedly said that he intended to break up the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. And look what happened to him. All I can say is good luck, because you'll have to burn it all to the ground and start again. And I don't see it happening. I hate to say.
That's some really interesting intake, Mark, because it seems like Obama's gone full blown with it. His appearance working in the shadows of this election, of getting Joe Biden, through making the phone calls to Buttigieg and to Amy Klobuchar to get the guy who's in 5th place, supported, while he has the guy who's in second place to drop out in Buttigieg. It's crazy, and I don't know how we get a hold of it and change things. It's a scary time.
How did we get to a point where the Democratic Party, in the media, in the figures in the Senate and Congress, started treating neocons like John Bolton as heroes that would save them from Trump? And this is no matter what happens, who's elected, the neocons somehow always end up on top, right? All right, Trump possibly threatened to that, and you had Robert Kagan and the neocons run to support Hillary Clinton and raise her banner.
Yeah,
she lost, and Flynn out the door, them around the other side, and now the neocons are in control of the Trump administration too. It happened with Obama, right? I mean, who is Valerie Plame? She's the wife of Robert Kagan, and she was dictating what Obama's administration was up to, backing a putsch in Ukraine, which increased tensions with Russia. They always win.
Yeah.
The game is rigged.
Yeah. You know what Mike Gravel once said? He said when he had dropped out of that race back when they were all running in 2008, he said that the most dangerous guy on that stage, the most dangerous person on that stage is President Obama, because he really actually thinks that he can change this system, but it's going to change him. And look what happened.
That is real analytic soothsaying, intestine reading, whatever you want to call it there. That is exactly what happened.
Mark, thanks for joining us today. That was some interesting talks, but Johnny's got a question to close us out about what's going on in Russia. Go ahead, Johnny.
I'm just curious if there's been any protests or anything in Russia. I haven't really looked into that for the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't know if you've seen any. No. I mean, that it's completely foreign to Russia. Russia has actually been fairly muted to what they could be doing, pointing out U.S. hypocrisy over all of this thing. If anything, it's rather amusing, because the nominally pro-Western Russian liberals, a little known fact about this fringe minority, this 5% in Russia, is they're all racists. They hate all of the non-Russian ethnic people of Russia, and there's a lot of them. There's some 200 ethnicities in this country. All the Chukchi and the Chechens and the Dagestani and all of these other minority peoples of Russia, because they believe that they are Asiatics, holding them back from their fated white European future. And you've had all kinds of statements, crazy statements on Twitter, embarrassing even Western, hacks in Russia who write nothing but, glowing praises of these, Russian liberals, like Russian liberals like the racist ultra-nationalist Navalny. they won't mention this in articles or anything like that, but even they've been shaking their head and face palming over the racist statements, Russian liberals posting things on Twitter, memes, Martin Luther King, and so on. The Russian government has been really muted, compared to what they could be in all of this, perhaps even more, than China has been in all of this. And there hasn't been any protests, no type of solidarity protests or any. Russians are far removed from that. This U.S. race relations are because of their history of slavery. They have nothing to do with us. We were trying to, free the African people during the 60s and 70s from the British Empire and the French Empire and Western colonization. This stuff is unable for us to relate to. Not to say that there's no racism in Russia, but they didn't bring over several million slaves, to the country, and so they don't have a legacy of it. That it's such a big thing for them. But the fringe Russian liberals on Twitter are out there talking about the awfuls of the looting and Black Lives Matter and everything, and that really tells you that you can't superimpose what you want from the politics of the U.S. and think that liberal and conservative and right and left in any way match up with the politics of Russia or with any other non-Western country in the world, to be frank.
And I guess, the very last question is, would you say the Russian government is kind of run in the same way as the U.S. government is? So basically, like, is Putin just kind of like a puppet? Is he really making decisions there, like how our president?
Oh, no. The exact opposite. Putin really, this is a power vertical. Putin has literally recreated the mess that Boris Yeltsin left and created the Russian state the way it is today, to the point, and I think at this point, it's starting to become a liability, where the idea of a Russian political system continuing without Putin scares a lot of people in the elite of the country, not just the common people of the country. So it's the complete opposite. I don't agree with everything that Putin has done. I do agree with a lot of his foreign policy, with a few glaring mess ups that I think he made by not being hard and realist enough. It's the exact opposite situation here.
Okay.
I
imagine
Putin,
there are
you have to
Russian
remember,
oligarchs.
did emerge out of the KGB, the FSB himself. And a lot of people have analyzed the number of former intelligence people that do have positions within his administration, within his government. It's not as many as they think it is, but around 10-20%. It's not insignificant.
Yeah, I'm sure there are Russian oligarchs, that probably have some type of influence in the government. I'm saying.
Actually, it's the exact opposite.
Oh, okay.
Right? The social contract that Putin created was he kicked the Russian oligarchs out of politics. The Russian oligarchs are excluded from politics. They cannot spend their money getting people elected in this country. And even just a few years back, the court Russians that write for the Western media, the fringe liberals there, like Masha Gessen, was despairing in the pages of the New York Times that the last best Western hope to overthrow Putin, the Russian oligarchs, weren't going to have any effect. Now, there are oligarchs. There is a new breed. These are stewards of nationalized natural resource companies. But as Putin has proved again and again, these people are not there permanently, and they are removed when they have too much money and too much power and become an independent threat of power to this oligarchs out of politics thing that was the social contract that he created since the 90s.
Yeah. I think a lot of people try to, especially Western media and movies, they try to emulate Putin as this Max Zorin character from A View to a Kill.
He is a James Bond villain, isn't he?
What's that?
Isn't he? Isn't Putin a Bond villain? I thought he was
Yeah.
created by Ian Fleming.
Remember that Christopher Walken? He was an ex-KGB Max Zorin taking Grace Jones, going out for global dominance. That's what they try to, make Putin look out to be. And by the way, somebody said, Super Chat contribution said, you meant Victoria Nuland on Ukraine.
Newland.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I knew what you meant.
Absolutely.
And I just want to leave us with this one note. It was Joe Biden who gave Victoria Nuland the thumbs up on that phone call to go ahead with regime change in the Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark Sleboda. We love you. We'll have you back on soon. Everybody, you can find Mark Sleboda on his Twitter. He's got some great stuff going up there. Mark, you got anything in the future going on that we should know about?
Yes, and I'll let you know when it's out.
All right, buddy. Thank you for joining us.
We'll be talking to you then.
You will. Call me personally. Thank you so much for Mark Sleboda, Pasta Jardula, Jonny Tsunami on the ones and twos. This was
Johnny!
Foreign Policy Junkies. My man Mark, Convo out.